Assigning file and folder permissions enables you to control access to file resources. We already looked at setting up shared folder permissions, and that's great for folders that you're sharing. But if you're intending to control access, including locally, you need to use NTFS or REFS file server permissions. Both NTFS and REFS volumes can be configured with file and folder permissions. You can configure these permissions in a number of different ways, including by using File Explorer and command prompt tools. To use File Explorer, right-click the folder that you want to secure, choose Properties, click the Security tab, and then you can use the dialog box shown here, permissions for, in this case, accounts, to specify the permissions that you want to use. From the command prompt, you use the icacls command. There are a number of parameters. /grant grants user permissions, which replace any existing explicit permissions. I'll talk about explicit and implicit shortly. /deny denies user permissions. An explicit deny access control entry is added, and the same permission in any explicit grant are removed. /reset replaces the specified access control list with the default inherited access control list. I'll talk about inheritance shortly. F grants full access, M is modify access, RX is read execute access, R is read only access, W is write only access, object inherit, and do not propagate inherit. The concept of inheritance is something I'll touch on in a moment, but essentially by grouping files in a folder and grouping folders in subfolders, you can specify permissions and use inheritance to simplify the process of configuring permissions. By default, a subfolder inherits the permissions from its parent folder. The following are the available file and folder permissions. They apply slightly differently when applied to folders or to files. Generally, you'll not apply permissions on individual files. It's more usual to apply them to folders, which contain a collection of like files that will be accessed by similar users. Full control, when applied to a folder, allows reading, writing, changing and deletion of both files and subfolders, and allows for the modification of permissions on folders. It also allows a user to take ownership. Description of when applied to a file allows reading, writing, changing and deletion of the file, allows modification of permissions on files. Now it's important to note that the significant difference between modify permissions and full control is the ability to take ownership and the ability to change permissions. Generally, you do not need to assign those permissions, those two specific permissions, to most users on most objects. So modify is probably the highest level of permissions you need generally to assign to data folders. When you assign modify permissions, it allows reading, writing and changing and deletion of files and subfolders, but doesn't allow users to change permissions, likewise on files. Read execute allows you to open the contents of a folder to access the folder contents and to execute files within the folder. If you have read execute permissions on a file, it allows you to access the file and to run the file. List folder contents doesn't apply to a file, but does apply to a folder and is pretty self-explanatory. Read permissions allows you to view the content of a folder, allows the contents to be read, in other words. On a file, it allows you to access the content so you can open the file, but does not allow you to run a file. And write allows for the addition of files and subfolders in a folder and allows a user to modify, but not to delete a file. Now there are some advanced permissions that you can assign. I would say that 99% of the time you won't go anywhere near advanced permissions. I think, if I can remember correctly, there are something like 13 permissions in total, including these advanced permissions, and you probably use about 6 of those. So there are 7 or 8 additional permissions. On their own, they don't mean a great deal, but it's important that you know what they are. So traversing a folder and executing a file, you might want to assign that particular permission specifically to get around a problem. For example, if a user needs to access a subfolder that they have permissions on, but they don't have permissions on the parent folder, then you can grant them traverse folder permissions on that parent. Now, I would argue that it probably means you haven't grouped your folders together correctly. If you're having to navigate through bits of the file system you don't have permissions on to get to bits of the file system you do, you probably need to move things around on the file system in a more logical manner. But nevertheless, that's what that permission does. List folder, read data. Read attributes. All files have attributes. These are properties, if you like. So, for example, you can have a file that has a read-only attribute. You can modify the attributes from the command prompt or from within File Explorer. They're not to be confused with permissions. Now, for a number of reasons, you might want to allow a user to be able to read the attributes of a file or read its extended attributes. You may even want to have them modify the attributes and extended attributes, and those are individual advanced permissions. I can't think of a situation where I've ever done that. Create files and write data without the ability to view them afterwards. Again, a bit curious. Create folders and append data. Write attributes and extended attributes. To delete subfolders and files. To change permissions and take ownership. Now, those are very interesting permissions. I mentioned that those are the two permissions, change permissions and take ownership, that are lacking from modify, that are available in full control. If you think about it, if you allow a user to take ownership of a file, they then have full access to the file, and they can then change permissions on the file. If a user can change permissions on a file, they can stop everybody else from accessing the file. So generally speaking, it's not a good idea to allow users to have either the change permissions or take ownership properties, except perhaps on their own data files. So a rough rule of thumb is when you're assigning permissions, use the modify permission as opposed to full control. When you're configuring security, you may find that you spend most of your time in File Explorer on the property sheet for a folder, setting permissions on the security tab. But you may want to get involved with managing the advanced properties. There are several things you can do here. You'll notice on the screenshot here the option to disable inheritance. By default, if you create subfolders within a given folder and you assign permissions on the folder, all of the subfolders and the files that appear beneath that are treated as children type objects, and they inherit the same permissions. This makes it very easy for an administrator to set up file permissions. You group like file resources together. So you create a folder called data and you put departmental shares in there, sales, marketing, and so on. You grant a level of access on data, read, for everyone so that they can navigate through the folder structure, and then you assign permissions at the departmental level based on groups. And by grouping files together like that in folders, it makes it very much easier. You may want to disable inheritance. And this indicates a difference between permissions that are implicit and explicit. An implicit permission is one which is implied through inheritance. So I might have full control on a file because it's in a folder that I've got full control on. So the file has implicit inherited permissions. The folder has explicit full control permissions. So if I want, I can disable inheritance by clicking the Disable Inheritance button. I've also got access to the Auditing tab here. By default, file auditing is turned off, but if I enable that through the security policy on the computer, I can then use the Auditing tab here to configure what it is I want to know about. So I might want to know if somebody changes a file in a particular folder, or I might want to know if someone accesses a file or folder that they don't have permissions to. So I might want to look out for object permission denied on a given object, and I can configure that on the Auditing tab. And effective access is a great way of checking that you've configured everything correctly. From effective access, you can see what permissions a user actually has, and hopefully that ties into what you think that user ought to have. So you can see here in the Inheritance tab, on the Permissions tab, the Inheritance button, if I were to click Disable Inheritance, I would see this dialog. It says, what do you want to do? Okay, so at the moment the folder you've selected is Inheriting Permissions. Do I want to remove all of the inherited permissions so that it's a blank access control list and start over? Or do I want to convert the inherited permissions to explicitly assigned permissions? And that's the default. And that's usually what you do. So in other words, it copies the access control list from the parent explicitly to the child, and then you can modify it from there. What happens when you copy and move files around? Well, when you copy files and folders, they inherit the permissions of the target folder. So if it starts in c/data and you copy the file to c/data/sales, then it would inherit the permissions of the target folder, in this case, /data/sales. When you move files and folders in the same volume, they retain their explicit permissions. So that's any specific permissions that you have explicitly assigned, not inherited permissions. When you move files and folders to a new volume, they inherit the permissions of the target folder. Sometimes when you've made these move operations, it can be confusing to work out who has what permissions. So you can use the Effective Access tab to determine that. As you can see here, the folder we're looking at is e/data/accounts. The owner is a user called Andrew. That's the name of the computer, and we're trying to determine what permissions Sally has. She's a user on this computer here, and you can see that she has modify permissions. In other words, everything except for full control. So in the demonstration, let's take a look at how to secure a folder and then how to verify effective access on the folder. So open up File Explorer and go to this PC and navigate to a folder called Data. Let's have a look at the permissions on data first of all to see where we're starting from. If I click on Properties and click the Security tab, you can see that authenticated users, system, administrators and users have been assigned a level of access. You can also see what that access is, but note it's light grey. That's telling me that the permissions that have been assigned to this folder have actually been inherited. So there are no explicit permissions on the c/data folder. They are all inherited permissions. To change the permissions, I click either Advanced or Edit, depending on what I'm trying to do. So click Edit here and add a new user. Let's say Dave. I think there's a user called Dave. There is. Click OK. Dave now has read, execute, list and so on down here. I'm going to grant him full control and click OK. And you can now see in the security list, there's Dave, and he has these permissions which are not grey anymore. They're listed in bold check marks, because he has explicit permissions on the folder, whereas these people have inherited or implicit permissions. So that's easiest. That's how you change permissions. Very straightforward. So I'll click OK to that. Let's go to the subfolder Marketing and look at its permissions. And we can see something interesting here. Dave has got inherited permissions on that subfolder. This is the cornerstone of setting up file and folder security. If you group your folders together in a sensible, logical manner, then it's very easy to configure file system security. You do it from the top down and rely on inheritance. But suppose Dave doesn't or shouldn't have permissions on the marketing folder. Well, in this instance, then you could change things. You could click Edit here, select Dave, and you could remove his permissions. Okay. Now, as you can see, it's telling me I can't do that. Hang on, because I'm actually inheriting permissions. So there's nothing actually to turn off. So what I'm going to need to do is something slightly different. I'm going to click on Advanced, and I'm going to have to disable inheritance on this folder. I'm going to convert inherited permissions into explicit permissions. I'm just going to show you what that looks like by clicking OK. And you can now see that all the permissions that were previously inherited and were indicated as being such by having a grey checkbox are now specific permissions or explicit permissions on this folder. And now I can choose Edit and I can select Dave and choose Remove. So that's the difference, I hope you've seen that, between implicit inherited permissions and explicit assigned permissions. Okay, so now I'm going to set some permissions on the sales folder. I'm going to start by changing the data permissions. Let's go to data first of all. Right click, choose properties, select security. I'm going to remove David from there. Oops, wrong one. Sorry, authenticated users. Click OK, and now click OK to that. And something interesting, suppose I've got a large folder structure in place beneath. I've got two subfolders as it happens, but suppose I had hundreds of subfolders. What if I wanted to change the toppest level permission and have that percolate down through the organization? Well, I can do that too. I can click on Advanced here, and I can say replace all child object permission entries with inheritable permissions from the object. So in other words, I'm removing explicit permissions that are assigned further down the tree with implicit permissions from this point forward. And if we were to take a look at the subfolder, marketing for example, we should now see only inherited permissions. So you've got the option to, from a child, go to Properties, Security, and you can then choose to disable inheritance. And from a parent, you can go to the Advanced button here and say replace all child object permissions once you've reconfigured. So that's a very convenient way of managing the issue of inheritance. So now let's set things up properly. At the moment, on the data folder, authenticated users have modified permissions. That's maybe a bit high. So I'm going to change things a little bit. I'm going to go to Advanced and disable inheritance and convert everything to specific permissions. And then I should be able to remove authenticated users' permissions. I don't want them to have full control. I want them to have the ability to read, execute only. So I'm going to remove modify. I'm going to remove write. And I'm just going to leave them with read, execute, list folder contents, and read. So they should be able to navigate through the data folder. I'm going to leave the system administrators as they are. Users already only have the appropriate permissions. So if I sign in as a user and navigate through data, I can't do anything with the data. Next, I'm going to grant permissions on marketing for marketing users. And the easiest way to do that is to use a group. There's a group called marketing. Oops, well, there should be. That's if I spell it correctly. That's better. Marketing, and I'm going to grant the marketing group modify permissions. Remember, avoid using full control unless it's absolutely necessary. And on the sales group, I'm going to similarly change that. And I'm going to grant the sales users modify permissions, and everything else is inherited, so I'm happy with that. So let's give that a test. Now I could sign in as a user that's a member of sales and a member of marketing, but instead I'm just going to check who those people are. Let's open up computer management and click on local users and groups. If I click on groups, I've got sales and marketing. Who belongs to marketing? Sally. And under sales, I've got Dave. So let's look at the marketing, properties, security, and I'm going to choose, let's have a think there. I'm going to click advanced and choose effective access. And I'm going to select a user called Sally, and then view effective access for Sally. So you can see that Sally has permissions, traverse folder, execute files, and so on. Doesn't have the ability to delete subfolders or change permissions or take ownership. So she has modified permissions. And I guess that's through the membership of her group. Let's now select a different user. And you can see that Dave, because he doesn't belong to the marketing group and therefore hasn't got special permissions on the marketing folder, has the ability to basically read. So he can read attributes, extended attributes, read files, list folder, and read data, and traverse folder and execute file. So in other words, read type permissions. So that's looking exactly how I want things to be. So in the demonstration, we saw how to secure a folder and how to verify effective access on the folder. When you share a folder and assign permissions, in this case this is everyone has full control, remember the default is everyone read, you're obviously securing, or typically securing, NTFS folders which you've also configured file permissions on. Now what happens when a user signs in as a member of the managers group and tries to access the e/data/managers folder? NTFS says that they have modify permissions, but the shared folder says that they have full control. So which is right? Well, I would say that the best way of remembering this is the least permissions apply. Now that's not quite true. If I was to do special permissions at each end, it would end up that nobody had any permissions. So it's a bit of a simplification, but it usually works. In actual fact, it's the agreed upon permissions. In this case, the user accessing through the shared folder should have full control. But the file system says you've only got modify permissions. So the only agreed upon permissions are modify. So the effective permissions through the share are modify. So for the exam, remember the least permissions apply. But for the real world, remember it's the agreed upon permissions.